we like to call it the Supernatural Hour. And now, our hosts.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We are back for the Supernatural Hour. DeAnn is back. Yay!
Hello, I'm back.
We also have Silent Dawn.
Hello.
We have Beeker.
What's happening?
Alright, so let's get on with our topic. We have chosen the topic tonight of vampires. And some of you may ask, why vampires? What does that have to do with paranormal? Well, quite frankly, nothing.
But when we told several people last night that we were talking about vampires, their eyes lit up. So
kind of what we're doing, I know we've touched on this briefly. Yes, we do talk about ghosts and investigations, but again, there's only so much topic we can talk about with that without just being super redundant. So we are going to touch on other supernatural topics, and we'll get into the history behind it. We're going to try and stay away from too much actual fiction, but we're going to talk vampires. So, Tim, would you like to lead our discussion tonight?
Sure. So what I do know is that the vampire sensation kind of actually started right about the same time as our last topic. It was towards the end of the whole Salem, or not the Salem witch trials, but just the witch trials in general that were going throughout Europe. This was the time when they were kind of transitioning into using actual science to discover things, but they were still relying a whole lot on superstition. They also had vampires, and I remember one of the first recorded cases that they talked about was, I can't remember the guy's name or what country it was in, but there was a spirit, or not a spirit, sorry, because spirits is normally what we deal with. There was a guy that was buried, and it was probably about 45 days or so after his death, where a lot of people kind of had reported seeing him in their houses at night and whatnot. And they had, I believe this little city that they were in had approximately like 19 deaths from people just like having severe loss of blood. And that's actually kind of where the name vampire comes in. Is vampire, I guess, is Slavic for bloodsucker.
Right.
So what was going on is you had all these people that were just kind of dying, and it seemed like it was all from a loss of blood. And so they actually pulled up this guy's grave and opened up his coffin, and he was still in there, and he showed the normal signs of like regular decay, but the inside of his coffin was also covered in blood, which wasn't there when he was buried.
Well, what's interesting too is, and we'll get into this in a little bit more depth, but decomposition actually works a little bit differently when you're buried versus above ground. And so it's not what they were used to seeing, the regular decomposition. And so, yeah, they kind of freaked out and thought, dude is a vampire.
That's what I've got so far.
What was interesting in my research, though, as I looked into it, a lot of cultures, in fact, most cultures have some kind of vampiric lore. In fact, I know ancient Greece did.
I read about that. It was in the Greek mythology where, what was the guy's name? I can't remember.
I have his name.
Okay,
This is actually I love Greek mythology. So it was about 400 to 800 BC, and it was in Delphi, and there was an oracle there that people would go to get their prophecies. And there's a guy named Ambrosia, and he fell in love with one of the priestesses at this oracle. And
isn't that like a terrible fruit salad made with like whipped cream?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is. And so he fell in love with this girl, and he says, hey, we're going to run off and get married. Well, this really pissed off Apollo, because Apollo kind of liked this girl too. Apparently she was like super hot. So
Selena was her name. I found the notes on that one, but yeah. Go ahead.
Anyway, he wanted her, and so he got really mad, and he said, and again, this is really brief, but he said, and he cursed Ambrosia, and he said, anytime that you're in the sun will burn you, to try to keep him away from Selena. So, so he's sad. So he sends a note to Selena and says, hey, I'm not going to be able to meet you, but hang on. He runs off to Hades, and he kind of says, because he's got to be in the dark because he can't be in the sun. And Hades says, well, I'll help you, but you need to go and kind of like be a double agent, go hang out with Artemis, who is Apollo's sister, and try to get her silver bow. And so, he ran off and was trying to get this bow from her, and she found out that, he was trying to be sneaky, and so she cursed him that he would get burned every time silver touched him. So now he's like double cursed. He can't be in the sun, he can't touch silver. So he, gets a hold of Selena, says, I'm still trying to get us together, hang in there. And so then he makes another deal with Artemis, and she says, well, if, how does this go?
Well, so what I've got here is that she actually felt bad for him
She did.
because of what was going on here. So she actually kind of gave him a blessing at this point and gave him super strength, immortality,
Yes.
and fangs to kill the beast so he can use their blood to write love poems to Selena.
Right. And so they ran off and they actually lived together. They could live together, they just couldn't touch each other. So they lived together, for years and years, but the problem is he isn't aging and she is. And so at this point Artemis says, well, if you drink her blood, she'll become immortal and you guys can be together forever. So he did. And when he bit her and drank her blood, her spirit kind of went up and joined the moon. And she became the goddess of moonlight, not the goddess of the moon, that's different, but the goddess of moonlight. And so when the moonlight would touch him, that's, she could finally touch him, and they were together forever.
And then here it also says, from that point, when they combine the two of their blood together, and anyone that drinks that, they turn into a vampire.
And they're their children.
Interesting. See, I didn't run across the Greek mythology. I read into some other stuff. I know that there's an Australian vampire that looks like a frog.
That makes Tim and I cooler than you.
That's debatable.
Actually, it's not. But keep telling yourself that, pal.
There's an Asian vampire that would basically drag its intestines around and kind of use its tongue as like a foot to kind of help drag itself around. Every culture has some vampire story or other, but what's interesting with that Greek one is it actually explains a lot of stuff with the vampire that everybody else is fairly familiar with, which is the Eastern European vampire, which is thought to be a mix of Christianity and Indian belief, because the Indians from India, in India they had these myths about blood-drinking demons, and then Christianity was kind of sweeping across Europe. And Christianity, for everyone who's familiar with Christianity, deals with basically the holy divine blood of the Savior, which is all cleansing. And so these two kind of cultures mixed. And so kind of the thought behind the vampires drinking blood was that it's kind of a cursed immortality where they would basically consume someone else's blood to stay immortal, but it was kind of a cursed immortality because they were taking it from somebody else.
Just like Voldemort.
Just like Voldemort. I have no idea. I'm just agreeing with the reference. I don't understand.
Harry Potter? You don't understand Harry Potter?
I do, but it got
You were
confusing
dead
in
to
last
me.
book.
He's not a vampire.
I know, but he drank blood to stay alive.
With unicorn blood.
Doesn't specify what kind. Blood is blood. It was silvery blood.
Unicorn blood, it says in the first book. Yay, Harry Potter. I don't know how we got from vampires to Harry Potter, but we're there, folks.
Because Voldemort drank unicorn blood to stay alive.
And there you go, he's a vampire.
All right, so let's talk about ways that it was believed you could become a vampire. First and the most obvious one, I think the one that pop culture really latches onto, is you get bit by a vampire and you can become a vampire. And pop culture has it that you can either drink a vampire's blood or just getting bit. It just depends on who's writing the script. But that was, even back then, was a belief that if you were a victim of a vampire, you were more susceptible to become a vampire yourself.
We'll see, and if you go back into the, like we were talking about with the Greek mythology, it starts off with simply drinking the blood.
Another method was suicide. If you committed suicide, you were more apt to become a vampire. If you're murdered, you're more apt to become a vampire. Improper burial would make you more apt to become a vampire. Alcoholism. If you're an alcoholic, you could be a vampire. My personal favorite, though, is if a cat or dog jumps over your fresh corpse, you are likely to become a vampire.
They needed Netflix back then.
I think I'm going to become a vampire when I die. So can you make sure your dog jumps over me?
See Tim's corpse. Here, Spot. Here, Spot.
I'm going to come over to your house and be like, coughing blood. Can you have Emma jump over me? I want to come back as a vampire.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned coughing blood, because an untreated infection can also be something that causes vampirism. So I'm pretty sure between the dog jumping on you and coughing blood, you're 90% there.
Sweet. Immortality.
Just drink a few beers before you die. Get kind of toasted.
Yeah, a little toasted. Practice a little witchcraft.
Just make sure you only bury my foot, because that would follow the improper burial.
But see, here's the fun thing, though, is it said, to try to stave away the vampirism, we could nail him to his coffin, cut his head off, turn it around backwards so he can't see how to get out of his coffin, and dismember him. That's how you prevent vampirism. So we could have fun.
Unless we accidentally bury you alive.
Well, that's what the bell's for.
I think if you've cut off his head and turned it around backwards, you probably don't need to worry about the burying alive part.
You can never be too sure.
It's one or the other. One or the other,
Never be
folks.
too sure. So, a lot of times back in so as Tim mentioned, there's a lot of superstition and science was starting to just kind of rear its head. But anytime kind of sickness or tragedy befell a village, one of the first things they started doing was looking around for the vampire. They'd already apparently hanged or burned all the witches, so all we got left is vampires.
That didn't work. Next.
So what they would do is generally they'd figure out who the suspected vampire was, and they had a couple ways to do this. Depending where you're at, they usually took a virgin boy and they stuck him on a virgin stallion, and the stallion either had to be black or white depending on where you were at, and you took the virgin boy on the virgin stallion into the cemetery, and if the stallion balked at a grave, that grave was highly suspected to be the grave of a vampire. Now, another interesting note is the headstones. The stone headstones were thought to be placed to kind of help pin vampires in their graves. And if the headstone started to lean or fall over, that was a definite sign that a vampire was rising or had risen because he had kind of knocked that headstone over.
So pretty much everybody everywhere is a vampire. I spend a lot of time in cemeteries playing bagpipes and nary a straight one.
Well, if they weren't a witch, they were a vampire.
Vampire. If there was any kind of sinkhole in the coffin, vampire.
Again, every gravesite ever.
Vampire. If you're buried, vampire.
Well, I mean, we did say this was right about the time the witch trials were ending, so they needed something else.
They already hung or burned all the women.
And they were, well, even
And
men
not
were.
buried them in the graveyard.
Yeah, because I mean, the witches weren't allowed to be buried in the regular graveyards; they had to be buried somewhere else.
Vampire. All right, so now what was interesting is when they actually had a profession. Believe it or not, they actually had vampire hunters. That was their profession. They were usually respected clergy or like college professors.
They might quit their day jobs just to do this.
Yeah, they would actually go from village to village and kind of say, "Hey, you seen you had like 5 people die of the plague? You got the vampires." And so they'd start asking around, figure out who was the likely vampire, and they would dig up a grave. They actually had vampire hunting kits, which
I actually wrote some stuff down because I thought these vampire kits were interesting because it reminded me of kind of our ghost hunting kits, and I could see us being like back in the 1700s being vampire hunters instead of ghost hunters. So the things they would have, they had later they would have guns with silver bullets, but they would have stakes and holy water and holy oil. They'd have a Eucharist. They'd have ropes, crowbars, crosses. I can just see these guys with their little Walmart bags.
now they only had the holy water, the holy oil, and the Eucharist if the church sanctioned their vampire hunting.
Yes.
If they were not church sanctioned, then they didn't get to carry the holy water, holy oil, or Eucharist. What I found was really interesting, though, as I was doing my research on this, is a lot of times they also attributed sleep paralysis to vampires, and they would have, in some occurrences, basically paranormal ghost type activity, like poltergeist activity, that they would attribute to a vampire in the area, which I thought was kind of an interesting tie-in to some of the stuff that we've talked about. One thing that was really fascinating, though, is one of the things that they did is they would go into some of these areas where they thought they had the vampires, and they would bury them in such a manner as to prevent them from rising as a vampire. They'd put like scythes in their graves, like in a manner that if they tried to sit up, it would basically stab them. So once they tried to raise from the dead, they'd be like, "Ooh," stabbed and stay dead.
My favorite was the head cutting off and turning it backwards.
Yeah, they did all kinds of weird stuff. They used to cut the ligaments in the back of the knees, so if they rose, they couldn't walk. They'd cut the head off, they'd put it down by the knees or put it backwards. They did a lot of things, but the most interesting thing, and Tim touched on this a bit, was they were digging these bodies up, and keep in mind they didn't understand science or decomposition below ground, because bodies decompose at a different rate. They would see they'd have blood around the ears, nose, and mouth, and they'd be kind of bloated because they're rotting, but they assumed that the blood was from feeding, and that the bloatedness, they were full.
In addition, they would expect them to have rigor mortis because that was what they had experienced, but after a certain amount of time, the rigor mortis goes away and the joints of a deceased person become movable again.
Yeah, they become pliable again.
But they would expect them to have rigor mortis and be stiff, and when they dug up these coffins and the bodies inside, they didn't have that rigor mortis at that point.
And what was fascinating is they would basically take a stake, a wooden or iron stake, and stake them through the chest into the ground. Well, it depends. If you're in Russia or Germany, they'd stake you through the mouth. Other places, they stake you through the heart. And there's one other region, I can't remember which region, where they would stake you through the stomach. But they would basically stake them through the chest. And they said that when they do this, the body would groan. And what actually was happening is those gases that were building up from decomposition would pass out the throat through like the vocal cords.
Through the larynx and the...
Yeah, and give you an actual groan. So like, vampire! So that just confirmed that their dead was not actually dead. It was undead.
Yeah, another part of that was, it was the staking to the ground. They felt that would, by pinning them to the ground, they would then be able to decompose.
And also prevent them from rising.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite thing was they also said that there was one doctor that would go and feel for pulses, and he would say that he would feel slight pulses in some of these corpses. But if you ever picked up a board or picked up something and you felt your own pulse, I think he was feeling his own pulse. But I thought that was kind of interesting.
Now, one thing that kind of helped feed this hysteria, if you will, about vampires is in these days they didn't understand comas, and it was quite common to accidentally bury people alive. It was a kind of a hysteria. They'd actually put bells, like Tim was talking about, on graves because people didn't want to be buried alive. And so they'd dig up some of these coffins, and if it was somebody who just passed into a coma for a short period of time and they tossed them in the ground, they'd wake up and claw the inside of their casket before they suffocated. And they would open up the casket and see the claw marks and be like, oh, yep, vampire.
And a lot of the burials would happen very quickly because of the illnesses and the plagues that were going around, and you didn't want to have, dead people around very long, so you put them in the ground. Well, they might just be, like you say, in a coma or very weak from the illness, which they then recover from. But, they've been very, very buried very quickly. And
well, and in the days when you don't have preservation like we do now, I can tell you from experience firsthand that it doesn't take very long for a body to start smelling pretty terrible. And so that would be another reason why you'd want to bury it quick, because you don't want a stinking, rotting dead body hanging around for more than a day or so, because they don't smell good. Another thing too, when they would open these graves, a lot of times the skin would shrink back from the gums. They would kind of start to dehydrate, so their teeth would look elongated, their fingernails would look elongated, or the fingernails would fall off and they'd see the nail beds. The skin around the face would sometimes dehydrate, and so it looked like the facial hair was growing, which again kind of fed into their mentality that these people were not truly dead, that they're rising as vampires. Now, some of the methods of destruction were kind of interesting, because it depends where you were at, but some people believe that you burned them to put them to rest. You decapitate them, stick through the heart. In some places, they would bind the limbs, so they tie the arms and ankles together. What I found was really interesting is I did the research, is there's still places, kind of remote places like Romania and stuff, where they still practice some of these things. Where they'll actually go bury the person in a religious ceremony, bury him about a foot deep, and after the priest leaves, the family comes back, stakes him through the heart, and does all their anti-vampire stuff. And this is in modern day society where this still happens in some of these remote areas of Eastern Europe and other areas.
Some of the things I thought was interesting, when you go look back through history, you look at, the most well-known vampire today in folklore or in fiction is Count Dracula. And legend has it that the Count Dracula is sort of based off of Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula, who was a ruler in Romania, and he lived during, was it 1456 to 1462. Apparently he's been described as, I guess he was a just, but very cruel leader. And some of the things that he did is because he was fighting off the Ottoman Empire. But the way he got his nickname, the Vlad the Impaler, is how he liked to kill some of his enemies. And what he would do is he would take a big wooden stake and he would basically impale their bodies and then just put the stake out in front of his castle. And that was kind of a thing that, if I remember correctly, he did that was to just kind of ward off other enemies, being like, if you come, this is what awaits you. Now, some of the legend also says that while he was around some of his dying victims after he impaled them, he liked to dip his bread in their blood and eat it.
It's just so gross. Ugh.
It says whether or not this is true.
Who likes protein?
Whether or not that's true, it's still unknown. That's just one of the rumors about what he used to do. It's because of things like this that's where Bram Stoker kind of got the idea for Dracula.
Yeah, I say Bram Stoker actually didn't call his vampire Dracula at first. In fact, it was right up until the publishing date where he changed the name of the book to Dracula. He actually had some other name, but he figured out it was an actual person that was not that interesting. So he went after the Vlad the Impaler. The interesting part about Vlad, though, is I did some research on that. It's really unclear how vicious he really was, because it seems like a lot of the reports of him being super cruel were from basically his enemies. And so some of it seemed like it was more propaganda than anything, that the Saxons were not very pro-Vlad, so they were telling the Pope how awful Vlad was. So I'd be curious to know how much of it is legit and how much is just his enemies making him look like a real dick.
Well, from what I understand, in Romania, they still kind of look to him as like he was a hero of the people.
Oh yeah, he's still a folk hero in Romania. What was interesting is the name Dracul. It actually means the dragon. His father belonged to an order called the Order of the Dragon, but it also means devil. And Dracula, the la on the end, actually is son of. So he's the son of the dragon, or son of the devil. That's kind of what the Dracula means, which is kind of interesting.
That is interesting. I did not know that.
Reports have it that he supposedly impaled up to 200,000 people during his reign. And he actually spent most of his reign in prison, where it was reported that he impaled rats and birds and mice in his cell while he was imprisoned. Like I said, though, a lot of the reports it's kind of difficult to discern what is fact and what's fiction as far as what he did. It's been so long, and again, a lot of his enemies are the ones who reported what he was doing.
I thought you were going to say he spent most of his reign making impaling sticks if he did 200,000.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he was a leader, so he would have had servants for that.
Bring me another whittling knife. Now, another one who's really interesting is her name is Bathory.
Elizabeth Bathory.
Tell us about Elizabeth, Tim.
So Elizabeth Bathory she's not very well known, but she's probably the most infamous female serial killer of all time. She's, from what I understand, has more victims than any other female. They refer to her as a serial killer.
I think she qualifies.
I think so too. I believe she has a total. They contributed 80 deaths to her.
I've heard up to 650 in some of the information I've seen.
I was saying some of the research I saw is close to 400. So I mean,
yeah, she was.
There was a lot. Let's just leave it at there was a lot.
So basically, like the way that she's always been described to me is she was like the female version of Vlad the Impaler. What she would do is she would murder some of her peasants and torture them. And because of her rank, she was a countess, I believe. She was kind of untouchable, so she could do basically whatever she wanted. No one ever did anything about it. One of the ways that she would torture people is, I believe, she took nails and like shoved them underneath people's their fingernails.
Ouch.
But see, it says I've got here that she was also, like, when she was raised, and this is kind of like, it totally makes sense, like, why she would end up doing stuff like this, is that she was raised as a Satanist. Her parents raised her as a Satanist, and then her aunt also taught her about sadomasochism. And I guess she married at the age of 15, and her husband kind of like let all this stuff happen. And
Oops.
they're actually saying that she was actually really tame, so to speak, while he was alive. After he died, she just got worse.
Well, and part of the reason she did this was she believed that drinking the blood of all of these victims would help keep her young and immortal.
Right. In fact, some of my research stated that she also was kind of a firm believer of the "you are what you eat" kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And she not only drank the blood of some of her victims, but she actually cooked and consumed body parts of some of these victims. And it was all peasant servants of hers that she would, it's one of those where you get the job application. Do you want to go work for the Countess? No.
Well, in some cases, the parents would take their daughters there, thinking that she was going to train them and teach them etiquette and kind of
give them a leg up.
Yeah, and then she would just eat them. So
yeah, and with that, she was also the man that she married was below her in rank, and he actually took her name. She was higher rank as a countess than he was, and he was away a lot. And so she pretty much had run of the castle and could do pretty much what she wanted to do. But they talked a little bit about that relationship and some things that were going on there. But it also talked about like her nanny or the people that raised her were, the Satanists, her parents. They were into black magic, those kinds of things too.
Well, what was interesting is because she was preying on these peasants, basically nobody cared. In those days, the powers that be are like, what's a few peasants? So it was basically a non-issue what was going on up until that point.
Well, just wanted to throw in there some more of the ways that she tormented some of these people. She would cover them with honey and tie them up and let the bees and the ants get to them. They, like DeAnn mentioned, she would eat them. Like she would just bite chunks of flesh out of her victims. And there was also one victim that she supposedly forced this girl to cook her own flesh and then eat it.
Ew.
Kind of like in, I don't know if you ever saw Hannibal, where he made Ray Liotta's character eat his own brain. It's similar like that. She made this girl cook herself and then eat it.
Ew.
Eventually, because she had done so much, it did get back, and she was imprisoned in her own castle.
Well, what ultimately kind of brought her down was she ended up preying on one of her noble servants, who did have some noble blood. And once a noble woman had died, then the actual powers that be started to suddenly care because, it's okay to lose a few hundred peasants, but all of a sudden when somebody of rank and power disappears,
then you got trouble.
And so that's kind of, I think, what was her ultimate undoing, was the fact that she ended up preying on a noblewoman.
So she was actually put on trial. This is where I got the 80 from. She was put on trial for 80 counts of murder. Everyone that helped her was actually convicted, but she got off. She was convicted, but she wasn't executed. She was the only one that got out of execution. They did throw her in jail, and the room that she was in only had slits for air and food. And they said she somehow survived for 3 years.
They actually bricked her into her. In fact, if I remember right, it was her own room.
Yeah. So she was there for 3 years before they found her dead in 1614.
Well, the interesting thing is, I guess she had gotten, the attention of the guard and told the guard that her hands felt cold, and he told her, go to sleep, and then in the morning she was dead.
Yeah, he peeked in and found her unmoving. That was the end of Elizabeth Bathory. Now, one thing to note with vampires, the original vampire, as seen by early Europeans, was basically a shambling, walking, stinking corpse that would go around and drink blood. In fact, the whole thing with garlic was believed that the smell of garlic was pungent enough to ward off the smell of dead body. And so that's where the whole garlic thing came from, which was also used by vampire hunters.
But if you watch the movie The Lost Boys, garlic doesn't work.
Nope.
You're right. Which leads to a fantastic point. About the time of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was in 1897 was when that book was published, and for just a side note, is the second most published book, second only to the Bible, and is still in print today by most publishing houses. Bram Stoker kind of painted a different picture. what a vampire is. Then from there, other playwrights and books and movies started to kind of romanticize vampires. They made them kind of suave and debonair and kind of
Sexy.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's the word I was about to use, is kind of sexy.
You just watch Interview with the Vampire with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise. That's all it is they're all sexy vampires.
Then we get to 2000 and we have sparkly vampires.
Oh, Jesus.
Sparkly, sexy
They're
vampire.
not vampire. Sparkles, no. Bad vampires.
And everybody have a good night.
Good night.
You've been listening to the Supernatural Hour at AdvancedParanormal.com. The Supernatural Hour is part of the Radio Ronin network, found at RadioRonin.com. Copyright 2021 by Advanced Paranormal Services.